Good afternoon and welcome to the Cityscape Intelligence webinar on the impact of COVID-19 on the UAE and KSA market. I'm your moderator, Tanisha Naidu, Head of Content at Cityscape, and in this afternoon session, we deep dive into the effects of this pandemic on the economy and the real estate sector. As the world contends with the rippling effects of COVID-19, questions continue to arise around humanity's new reality, with one particular question plaguing the minds of many: when will this end? But perhaps that's not the question we need to be asking as a real estate industry. We should be asking, how do we continue? And that's exactly the question we want to address today. COVID-19 has created an unprecedented challenge for the economy and the real estate industry. And this means that there will be a seismic shift in the way we interact in our physical spaces and the way we shape our built environment and in the way we invest in real estate. Our speakers for this afternoon will give you an analysis of what's happening in the economy and the commercial market in the UAE and KSA. They are Simon Townsend, Senior Director and Head of the Valuation and Advisory Business at CBRE, and Dr. Chris Payne, Chief Economist at Peninsula Real Estate. Before we start this webinar, I would like to invite you all to submit your questions to the panelists in the question box located on the right side of your screen. We will try to answer them during the audience Q&A at the end. Now, kicking off our first session is Simon Townsend. We'll be looking at workplace trends today and in a post-COVID world. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you, and hopefully everybody can hear me. Good afternoon, everybody, and firstly, again, thank you to Cityscape for arranging this webinar. I think one of the things that we find when we are in a period of uncertainty, when the world is looking a lot different to what we thought it would, the more open discussions we have and sort of engagement with market colleagues and participants, the clearer hopefully the picture becomes for all of us. So thank you for that. By way of introduction, as mentioned, I'm Simon Townsend. I lead the strategic advisory teams here for CBRE. Most of you know who CBRE are, so forgive me, I won't give you a big in-depth introduction. I mean, I think you've worked with us either locally, regionally, or from one of our 500+ offices. And really, what our role is here today is to look at how the real estate world is changing and what we're seeing both today and in a post-COVID world. The purpose is not to give you an in-depth market analysis. I mean, that's a sort of a webinar in its own right, which would fill up all of the time. We'll touch on that, but go through some of the trends that we see and what that really means for us. And I think, I've been in the region for around 20 years now. And one of the things that, I'd say I've seen a lot of changes, both from a regulatory standpoint, whether it be the introduction of freehold, whether it be the changes to the ownership of companies, or whether it be the way that companies can trade through special economic zones and others. I've also seen a lot of physical changes. The Palm, the Burj Khalifa, the King Abdullah Financial District in Riyadh, and a majority of major infrastructure changes that have obviously positioned ourselves in a very different place than we were when I first arrived. All of these changes, though, have seen other external challenges: global financial crisis, oil price challenges, geopolitical challenges, and now we're faced with another one, the COVID effect. And I think one of the things that we're going to look is, what does that mean for us? So as we move on, and forgive me, I'll just share my screen. Hopefully, is that something you can see? I hope so. So from my point of view, I say I've been here 20 years. I've seen a lot of changes, and one of the forgive me one second just while I make the screen move. Here we are. So hopefully that's visible for you all. So what I'm going to do over the next 10 to 15 minutes is I'm going to give you a very high level overview of the market, and I say high level because, as we say, it's a webinar in its own right. I'm going to talk about some of the workplace trends, and then importantly, what does that mean for real estate? And what do we do next? So we will summarize at the end. There'll be some questions as was mentioned, and certainly hopefully be able to assist in answering some of those for you. So as we look at the workplace, one of the most important things for us is the interaction between the employee and the real estate itself. And as we move forwards, we'll see a lot of the impact and the trends are highlighting how perhaps these will change over time. But I think, there were changes happening before COVID. It's not as if, it was completely dark and somebody has turned a light on, or the inverse. There were a lot of things that were changing before. I think what we're seeing now is a lot of the changes required have been fast tracked. And as we look through the 6 or 7 different trends that we've highlighted, you'll see some of these look familiar to you, and you'll have heard some of these and have maybe looked at some of these as we, up to this point. But I think now we're really focusing on how we can implement these for the future. So as I say, I'll give a very high level snapshot of the market. I think, one of the things I would say, and one of the questions that we're always asked, I think locally, regionally and globally, is, well, if the markets are in a state of uncertainty, I assume this means everybody's going to take less space. And I think I want to deal with that at the very beginning. And I think it's not necessarily the case that, the two are linked. And what I mean by that is, it's important to remember that the way we're going to use our office space, the way we're going to use our commercial facilities going forwards potentially has changed. And as a result of that, as a result of perhaps space requirements per person changing, the utilization of common spaces, communal spaces within our own demise, what this could mean is the inverse is actually true. The inverse being we may need more space rather than less space as we move forwards. So that's something that, again, we should keep in mind. I think the market misconception that everybody is going to take less space, I think is something that is yet unknown, but certainly, the house view is that that may not necessarily be the case. So as we look at the region, as you all know, there's, some very strong government projects that are in place, particularly in the Kingdom, looking at Vision 2030 and how that plays a major part in changing the landscape of Saudi Arabia. And I think the processes and procedures that were put in place around that has really provided the platform, not that it's hedged against what's happening, because there are, material impacts there, but certainly has provided that platform for growth for the future. So we'll have a quick look through these sort of 4 headings, each one behaving, differently, but with some of the same underlying tones, and the same underlying tones being that, for obvious reasons, the market is in a slightly negative place to where it was at the beginning of the year. I think the commercial market habits are changing. Some of the large occupiers that had operations ongoing, those are still happening, but the relocation and the changes into office space, that's perhaps gone back to the drawing board. People are looking at how much space will they need in this new world, what that space will look like, how will they use that space, and more importantly, where should that space be? So that's something, there's a lot of analysis going on around there. Will people stay in the same building, for a lower rent, perhaps? Will they move to a new office space where concessions are perhaps provided by owners and others, where they could move net for the same rental? These are discussions and debates that are ongoing. And I think at the moment, the impact of that is not yet visible. The retail market, again, we all know in our respective markets that a lot of the shopping malls were closed. Retailers haven't been able to open. There have been lots of publications in the or comments in the public domain from retailers. I think the relationship between landlords and tenants has been important. It's perhaps grown stronger in a number of instances where concessions may have been given, leases may have been restructured to facilitate the ability to grow. The true impact of the impact on the real estate market from a retail point of view, we believe we'll see clearer from the end of Q3. I think the important thing to say, though, is with malls opening and new malls still under construction, with construction some close to completion, we are seeing a focus again for new retailers coming in, particularly those from the Asian subcontinent, and looking at entertainment around retail as a big concept. So again, the green shoots are starting to be visible in the retail space, but the true impact not yet seen. Hospitality today, obviously an important day in Dubai with tourism sort of opening up again. We hope this will provide some respite to the hotels that have sort of been closed. F&B is now open or opening. The rules are changing around that. One of the biggest challenges, of course, is in the Kingdom, with an underlying reliance on cultural and religious tourism. The restrictions on the number of tourists that can go through this year is significant, and we think there will be, as we go towards the end of the year, quite a noticeable shift in the positivity around that space. But it is, as we look at the Vision 2030 and we look at the plans within the UAE, hospitality does play a major part. So whilst this will be some short-term suffering, we do see that in the medium and long term, this will come back to being one of the asset classes of choice. There's lots of activity in the residential market. I think there always is when markets change. People either downsize because their personal situation has changed, or in some instances upsize for the same rents. So we are seeing lots of tenant movement in the rental space. I think in the freehold space, both across the whole of the region, the disposals are getting more difficult. So developers are having to prioritize incentives, payment terms, concessions and others that they give to try to keep that market flowing. Again, we do expect a little bit of negativity, but with some positivity coming in the short to medium term. So now we look at perhaps the main focus of today, and the main focus really is some of the workplace trends that we've seen. It's important that obviously that we learn from the past, and what we learn there helps us shape the future. I think that one thing that's important at the moment is that the challenges we have been presented with now mean some of the lessons that we've learned historically, they're not actually relevant anymore. Some of the data, some of the the things that have happened that we try to draw analysis from, actually it's not possible with the COVID effect, as we like to call it. Mentioned at the beginning some of the questions that we need to answer. I think one of the questions that we're often asked is, what do I do to protect the future of my real estate? And I think as the world is returning to work at different times, we are learning lessons from sort of our global colleagues, particularly those in Asia who perhaps slightly ahead in the return to work. And I mentioned that we learn from the past. I think at the moment we're learning from the now, and we're looking what's happening across Asia. What are the trends that are coming out? How are companies reacting to going back to the office? How is the human interaction with the workspace changing? And we're learning lessons from that, which hopefully will be able to translate into creating the environment that we need here to grow and create the future workspace. So CBRE has identified in one of our recent reports, and the report Workplace Trends, the link for the report is at the bottom there. I appreciate you probably can't click, but if you went through the CBRE website, you'll be able to find the report. And we identified 7 trends within that. And I'm going to go through the majority of those as we speak just now. But I think one of the most important ones, and one that, as many of you will be sitting in your home or a Starbucks or whatever it is, I think one of the most important ones we'll talk about is remote working and the way that's changing what we do. So when we look at the work environment, I think we all probably accept that our environment has changed. We've gone from, for those of you that are old enough, we've gone from office space full of cubicles to private cellular offices, then open plan was what we needed, and then flexible working. I think all of that is changing, and the environment that we work in is becoming a key component in retaining valuable talent. And that's an important thing to reflect on, because the talent pool or the labor market within which in the markets that we work is quite tough. And as companies, keeping our key assets, which are our employees, is very important. A recent study by Glassdoor, which we've had sight of, across all of the companies and all of the employees they interviewed, 85% of those employees were disengaged. Now, it becomes very difficult to retain a disengaged employee. So keeping the work environment in a way that enables employee retention, enables the companies to be efficient, is something that's going to be a key focus and a key trend as we go forwards. The next one is something that I struggle with, and again, it's an age thing. I'm certainly not a millennial or a Generation Z, but as we look at this, the new modern companies are actually being managed. Many have actually been created within the millennial and the Generation Z period, and the way that these companies are evolving needs to embrace that technology. In the wake of COVID, many of the firms that have been hesitant to adapt this technology are almost being forced to comply, and to comply very quickly, being able to adapt. And we look at future workspaces, whether it's AI, whether it's this 5G and everything else, The physical workspace, hugely important, but the social and smart way of working is going to really drive how we use that space. So, adapting with technology, having a tech-enabled future workspace is going to be key, one of the key trends we see as we move forwards. Now, clearly, maximization of space, you would think is common sense. We obviously want to get the most efficient use of the workspace that we have. But I think as more and more of us visit our offices less frequently, we have to look again about how we use that space and what we want to do when we're there. The creation and adjustment of collaboration space and more areas where teams can get together, noting the social distancing and other requirements is going to be a priority. Maybe less desks, maybe there'll be less physical single workspaces and more collaboration areas. And I go back to a comment I made about taking office space. There was a trend of firms decreasing the amount of office spacing. They were coming together, consolidating their holdings into a single asset, creating more efficient spaces with smaller amounts of space per person. I do believe that the opposite trend is now going to happen, and potentially layout changes will mean that either the space requirement will be the same or marginally more. We're looking at smart buildings, maximization of space in the work environment. If you look at all of three of these together, there are examples of good quality buildings that are coming out in the market, innovative technology, innovative space, and evolving environments. And I think in the CBRE report that I mentioned, we have a case study on one of those buildings located within the DIFC, the ICD Brookfield building. And I would suggest it's well worth having a look at both the building, but also the case study to see how that building has adapted to these trends. Again, before the pandemic, there was already pressure on global corporates and occupiers to increase the employee experience. One of the ways they were doing that were creating more amenities, more facilities within the location of the office. I take DIFC, I take King Abdullah Financial District in Saudi Arabia. One of the key things that's been focused on there is providing the additional amenities to office occupiers, the F&B, the wellness, the hospitality, the government services, the medical, all of these things to enable people to maximize the use of their day. They can do all of their work and play, as it were, within the same environment. But it's not just the working environment. We have to also look at the community and the movement of people within the building. We look at the buildings that we all work in at the moment. We note small, congested common areas, queues for lifts at certain periods of time. With social distancing and others, the movement of people from their car park to their desk is proving very challenging. So when we look at the future of buildings, it's not just our own demise that's going to change. The internal characteristics and the movement of people within those buildings, the choreography of occupiers from car through desk is going to change and affect significantly how we design buildings. The next two are the two that I think we can probably all relate to at the moment, and I look at these two as being sort of interlinked. I think and there's a difference here I want to make. Work-life integration and work-life balance are two different things, and for me, we're here looking more at the integration of the two rather than the social side. But I think what it's interesting to see is there was a study in the US where they looked at, since 2004, how has your working life changed? And there's been a 38% growth since 2004 in the number of people that conduct some of their work outside of the office. That was telling, but I think the most telling statistic was over that same period, and this was carried out pre-COVID, I must stress, but carried out over that same period since 2004, more than 79% of the people surveyed indicate that they do most of their work outside of the workplace. And I think, for those of you that are based in sort of many of the major hubs, whether it be DIFC or parts of Riyadh, parts of Jeddah, trying to find a table at Starbucks is testament to that. It's full of people remote working, a laptop and empty cups of coffee. I think how we're working and where we're working is being hugely important. And I think one of the things here is that companies are going to have to look at providing the network, not just physical, but also technology to enable people to carry out this work remote. You sit on the aeroplane at 30,000 feet you're still getting access to Wi-Fi and carrying out as much work as you would, maybe slightly slower, but as much work as you would in the airport lounge. So we're having to adjust to that. And when we look at working from home, I have to be honest, I was one of many that, when it was first announced, thought this was going to be very difficult to adapt to. I think many of you will have had meetings, conversations where there's been a common theme where people are genuinely surprised how quickly we've all adapted and how seamless the transition into remote working has been. And just internally within our London business, or within our UK business, CBRE carried out a home sentiment survey in early May, bearing in mind the lockdown was in full force at its strictest in the UK then. And 84% of the people within that 2,500 sample set, 84% of the people thought that there'd either been a neutral or a positive impact on their sense of productivity. And I think that's something that we're hearing a lot. People do genuinely feel that they've been more productive working in this remote, sort of homework integrated approach. When asked how many people want to come back to the office permanently, less than 40% of the people thought going back to the office 5 days a week was going to be an important part and change the way they work. So again, I think it shows that the way that we're going to work has changed potentially for a generation. So what does this mean? And I appreciate in the interest of time, I'll sort of skip through, but I think there has been a lot of physical change. I go back to the question at the beginning, what should I do to protect my real estate? And I think, one of the most important things that you'll hear is words like agile working, flex working, fluid workspace. These are pretty much in every sentence, in every discussion that we have now. The word agility conjures up many different things. And to me, the word agility implies the ability to adapt to continuous change. It also suggests a never-ending need to twist and turn with the wind and whatever is thrown at us. And I think, as the martial arts legend himself, Bruce Lee, has said in the quote that you hopefully can see, the stiffest tree is most easily cracked, while the bamboo or willow survives by bending with the wind. The key for our real estate as we go forwards is to be the bamboo or the willow. We have evolved. We need to capitalize on this technology revolution. And I think you'll all have seen His Highness Sheikh Mohammed's Dubai 2021 plan, where he goes into press and expands on all of us that we need to go from an industrial-based workforce to a knowledge-based sector. To do that, we need to keep this agility. And this isn't just unique to Dubai and his vision. Within the 2030 vision in the kingdom, the idea is to transform many parts of the kingdom into smart cities with smart buildings and smart occupiers, and technology and the real estate workforce and the real estate workplace is going to be fundamental to how we achieve that. So what next? What does this mean for us? How do we get there? I think I go back to the question at the very beginning. What should I do to protect my real estate future? Well, I think with all of the challenges that we're seeing, a lot of the trends that I've skipped over quite quickly there, but a lot of the trends, by adapting those, by looking at being agile, by looking at creating the flexibility, creating a focus on our employees, the workspace, retaining employee engagement, by creating all of those, we can create the workplace of tomorrow today. The most important part, though, is we mustn't forget the real estate is important. The way we use the real estate is important, but what's really driving our business is our employees and the way that they interact with our business. So keeping that in mind, linking the human and the real estate as we go forwards is going to be one of the most fundamental things to enable us to hedge against some of the challenges that are coming forwards as a part of COVID. I appreciate I scanned through very quickly. There's a lot to fill in a 10 to 15 minute sample set. But as mentioned, the reports that I've referred to can all be found on the CBRE website. We have a COVID section in our global website with a lot of resources about how the rest of the world is reacting, what we're seeing in Asia, in Europe, in the US. And for those that are interested, I recommend having a look through that. From my point of view, there's certainly time at the end to answer questions. I think when we'll return and what it will look like, I think your next speaker, Dr. Chris, is much better placed than me to respond to. So thank you all for your time. Hopefully you saw the presentation, you could hear clearly, and I look forward to participating in any questions as we reach the end. Thank you all.
Thank you, Simon. Once again, if you have any questions for Simon, please submit them in the question box and we will answer them at the end of the webinar. I'm already getting quite a few interesting questions, so I'm looking forward to getting to that. Next up is Dr. Christopher Payne, Chief Economist at Peninsula Real Estate, who will discuss the GCC economy and real estate outlook, looking at KSA and UAE. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Tanisha, and thank you everyone, and good afternoon. Thank you for coming onto the webinar, and thank you for Cityscape for arranging. Right, I'm now going to share my screen, and hopefully, yeah, hopefully everyone can see that. So I'm going to talk today about the GCC economy and the real estate outlook. And particularly focusing on Saudi Arabia and the UAE, as you can see. So one of the things I'm going to start by really saying is something that Simon said, which is that COVID-19 is actually really exacerbates and fast tracks some of the trends that we've already seen over the last few years. Now, I really like those two words that he used, so thank you, Simon, for saying them. And really, the reason why I'm saying that up front is because one of the things that I will talk in detail about COVID-19 and these economic impacts, but I think it is really important to understand that to start out, we have to realise what's been going on in the real estate markets in the last few years, and that once we do that and understand that it's really been a problem with insufficient demand, then it actually becomes easier to think about what COVID-19's impact will be going forward. So stay with me. I'm going to start off with the first few minutes. I'm actually going to give a bit of history pre-COVID-19, and then once I've done that, hopefully you'll all see how that then really helps us understand the post-COVID-19 environment. So without further ado, let me begin by pointing you all to the bottom left-hand corner, and what you'll see there is two lines in the chart: UAE residential year-over-year real estate prices and real non-oil GDP growth. And I hope you can see clearly that there is a very high correlation between these two lines. And really what at the core of our analysis, of Peninsula's analysis, is that, as I said, the real problem in the last few years has been about insufficient demand and a weakening of demand growth. Now, a lot of people, obviously, we all know there's been a lot of talk about excess supply, but obviously excess supply and insufficient demand are two sides of the same coin. What we're arguing is that it's really what's been creating excess demand is actually a falling away, excess supply, I should say, is a falling away of demand. So, and that proxy is non-oil GDP growth. And I'm going to try and evidence before talking about COVID-19 that there is causality more than correlation between these two lines. Firstly, just on the concept of supply. I mean, if you see in the bottom right-hand corner, some of you will recognise these old-fashioned demand-supply curves. But what you will see is that if it just been an issue of adding supply, then we would have seen prices decline, but an increase in the quantity of transactions. The reality is in the residential market, at least in Dubai, where we have the data, we've seen a very significant decline in residential volumes. And that really can only be explained, if we believe anything about Econ 101, by a downward shift in the demand curve. So why has this occurred and what does it mean going forward? What I'm going to quickly run through is this point that oil prices fell at the end of 2014, as we all know. And because governments in the region, 90% of their revenues came from oil and gas, we saw a very sharp move from large fiscal surpluses in the region to large fiscal deficits. And because of that, governments rolled out significant fiscal controls. They didn't turn on the printing press. We are attached to our currency stability. It anchors the region, economically speaking. But those, so we had conservative and appropriate fiscal controls, and those fiscal controls led to a decline in demand, economic demand, which, as I will show, fed through into the real estate market. So let me just focus very quickly on these two charts, just to show that for each country, there are 3 bars. One is the surplus as a percent of GDP in 2013. One is the deficit as a percentage of GDP in 2015 or 16, and then what had been achieved by deficit reduction by 2018. And you can see, for instance, in Saudi Arabia, a deficit of 15% in 2015 had become a deficit of 6% in 2018. And the UAE at the general government level had eliminated the deficit by 2018. How did they do it? Well, you can see on the right-hand chart that it was helped by an increase in oil prices, obviously, but particularly in Saudi and the UAE, most of the deficit reduction came from fiscal control, i.e. either broadening the revenue base or cutting spending. So we've seen some real fiscal activity in the last few years in the region. And again, this chart really shows on the left that there's a very high correlation between the amount of spending power that's been taken out of domestic economies and the slowdown in non-oil real GDP growth. So that's really the story of the last few years. And you know, it's a pretty obvious one. If you take spending power out of the economy, the rates of growth slow, but it's probably not that one, not a story that's been as well understood as it could be. What does this mean for real estate? Okay, and I will then go on to COVID, but as you'll see in the top left-hand corner, we have some data on Abu Dhabi, which shows that there's a very high correlation between real non-oil GDP growth and changes in the annual population. Obviously, when the economy slows, people lose their job. That's the same pattern we see anywhere in the world. But in this part of the world, of course, losing your job often means leaving the country. So rather than seeing unemployment tick up, we see a slowdown or even a contraction of the population. And it's that contraction of the population that, of course, directly feeds into that downward shift in the demand for real estate. Okay, so that's why, of course, supply has exacerbated in some cases the downward shift in prices, but it's really very much been a demand factor as well. Now, that said, before COVID came along, what were we forecasting? We were forecasting, if you look at, say, the bottom left-hand chart there, we were expecting non-oil GDP growth to kind of trend around the 2% level, which, given, let's say, 5% decline, increases in supply, suggested maybe a small decline in 2020 residential real estate prices, maybe in the sort of 2, 3, 4% level. We were therefore expecting the market to stabilise, but without the fiscal taps being opened, which we were never expecting anyway, without the fiscal taps being opened, the upside to real estate was limited. It was more of a case of stabilisation. So that's why, now I'm going to move on to COVID, but perhaps already you can see that the causes behind the slowdown in terms of fiscal control and demand are only exacerbated by COVID. It doesn't really change the story greatly. So let me talk for the rest of my section about COVID. So firstly, you know, creating GDP forecasts in this kind of environment is nigh on impossible. Economic models are based on what you know from the past, but seeing as we didn't know anything about COVID and its impacts, it's difficult to factor them into the model. But you can see that we've made some very broad generic assumptions about private sector consumption and investment.